Okay, on this video I'm going to show the how-to of a shower pan. It's never really my intention to show do-it-yourselfers how to build a shower pan or more or less build a shower, just because there's some complications that arise with regard to plumbing and setting the pan and all that stuff that if it's done wrong it would be a big mistake. However, there are some people out there that are very good at doing it themselves regardless of what they do for a living, and so for those people, let me just explain a little bit about the shower pan process. This one's already set. This is a shower pan liner, to be more specific, and so I always sweat the valve in before I ever put the pan down, because you don't want drops of solder getting onto your pan. So that got done a little bit earlier. I always scab in these 2x6s on the side here, and some of my other videos show that. And I started doing that when I started building showers just because it made sense to me. I didn't like the idea of the pan, you know, dipping back with the mortar that I put in here. I just wanted some rigidity to the thing, and so that's why, you know, I toenail these 2x6s all around the side. The only place I skip is where it's not really possible, like this pipe right here, but it doesn't really matter. It's only about 3 inches or so. Anyway, that's what I do. Other people do it a different way. YouTube is full of people showing how to do stuff, and everybody has their own way of doing it, and there's no right or wrong way, but there is a correct way. In other words, incorrect would be that you have problems. And so this, after about 15 years of doing these, is the correct way of doing it, because I've never had a callback. I've never had any issues. Anyway, basically what we have is a curb, and this curb is made up of pressure treated 2x4s. I know there's other videos showing that you build a curb with concrete and bricks and all this other stuff, but really it's irrelevant. Wrapping the curb is very relevant, whether or not you use concrete, brick, 2x4s, you know, pressure treated the way I do, or whatever, because you do have issues with curbs sometimes, and because of that I always like to wrap the curb all the way down to the bottom on the outside. Anyway, that's the way I do it. And getting to the pan itself, the pan liner goes in as one contiguous piece. This thing is not going to be cut anywhere except right inside here. Now in the drain, let me get a flashlight. Again, as I said, everybody has their own way of doing it. The drain goes in by virtue of these bolts, and the bolts have this drain flange on it that, you know, the top of the drain gets screwed into. I cut like a cross, or square if you're not a square, or cross. I don't go quite up to the edge of the end of the drain. I just allow enough so that when I push this flange in, that you see those flaps. You see the flaps? So in other words, and you know, the water is going to naturally, if it does seep up under here, it's going to naturally want to go into there because it's got no other way of egress. I've seen other guys that have cut a circle around this pan, and sometimes they put the flange straight down, sometimes they put a bead of caulking up under it when they cut the circle, and then push it down, or push the flange down and let it dry, and I guess hope for the best. I don't like that idea. I don't even use caulking on this. There's no need to, because again, you know, the water has nowhere to go but down into the drain once this flange is set. And again, I've already screwed these down, so I'm not going to take them apart, but basically I do the same thing. I can reach up under the pan. Imagine the flange not being here. Once I make this cut, I can reach up under the pan itself, the liner, and I can feel the hole where the bolt goes in, and I kind of like push on it to know where it's at, and then I let the flap back down, and then I put my finger on top of the pan, and then I cut a little tiny cross, little tiny one, just enough for that bolt to slide through, and it slides through pretty tight. The cross that you cut is very, very small, and the bolt just gets pushed through as hard as possible until it hits that hole, and then it gets tightened down, and then ×4 all the way around. So again, the only cuts that are made, the only perforation that's made is this one cross right here, or X if you will, and then the 4 little ones for the bolts. Once that's done, then I can put the bolts, back them out, you know, enough to put this flange down and turn it. Turn it that way. Once they get locked in, then I can tighten them down. And then, of course, the cap goes on. And the cap goes on depending on what depth that you think you're going to have with the mortar. So, usually, and I never measure this, but usually I start out maybe, I don't know, about 2 inches, maybe 3 inches up from the bottom. So from bottom to about the edge of here, it's about 2 inches. And then as I add the mortar and tap it down and, you know, start to smooth it out and everything, then I realize that maybe that's too low, and then I back it out. And then I keep backing out and keep backing out. And I might end up with 4 inches over here, it's possible, by the time I get done. So it's better to start out low than it is high. Although it really doesn't matter if you start out high and you realize that this is going to be, you know, the spot that you need, then you can always turn it down. But that gets messy because then you have excess mortar that's going to get on top of here, and you don't want the mortar to go in the drain, obviously. This has a plastic lining on it that I take out after the tile is set and everything. But anyway, the point being is I usually set it about right there and then just pour the mortar in until I get to the level that I want. And if I have to back out a little bit, then I do. And then I readjust my mortar. Let me take this out. People always ask me about weep holes. And the weep holes are these little 4 things right here. And the weep holes will actually take water in. You can see the liner, and the liner is right at the bottom of the weep hole. So if any excess water gets into the pan, then theoretically it gets into the weep holes and, you know, drains right into the drain, which is another reason I use the flaps here so that it goes straight down. I can't imagine having just a little edge, if people cut a circle, just a little edge of that for the weep holes to get into, because it's possible that if the water does get in the weep holes, it could slide up under the pan liner, and then you've got a problem downstairs. So anyway, there are weep holes. There's also troughs. There looks to be about 8 of them, and these little tiny troughs will also let water slide down into the drain. So you got about 8 of these troughs, and then you have the 4 weep holes. And then in addition to that, on the inside, where the troughs are, a couple of them, let me see, there's 1, 2, there's 2 of them where the troughs are. There are no threads, and so when you turn the drain cap down, you know, you're going to have that little 1/8 of an inch or so from the top, that little 1/8 of an inch right there, opening for the water to drain down into the drain, if any excess water should get in there. So there's a lot of ways for water egress, you know, going into these drain caps. You know, then of course the idea is not to ever have water into your pan, but almost always water gets into the pan. It's a matter of how much and over how long time. Most of that is going to have to do with the tiling process. You know, when you tile, whether you're using 4x4, 2x2, or 1x1, you have grout lines, and grout lines are where the water is going to penetrate the most. So what I always tell my customers is to be sure to seal, you know, to saturate the bottom of the pan. Of course, you're going to do the walls too, grout lines on the walls, but that's not as important as here. And so you just want to saturate with sealer after everything's, you know, dried out. The tile and the grout and all that stuff is dried out after a couple of days. Just seal, 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 maybe 4 or 5 times, depending on what type of tile you have and how many grout lines you have. But I always suggest at least 3 to 4 times. Once that occurs, water has no choice but to go straight into the drain. It's going to be like a duck's back on the top of the tile, so water should not penetrate into the pan at all. Anyway, the most saturated pans I've ever had are usually upwards of 10, 12, 15 years old anyway, with crappy tile and non-sanded grout. So anyway, they do last, but I'm just saying if you want them to last longer, that's the way to do it. Anyway, I'm going to move on to the mortar process. Actually, I got to get started on this pretty soon because I got to get out of here. This takes me probably about 30 minutes to pour a pan. And what I use is I use this concrete mix. Is actually not concrete in terms of, you know, it doesn't have any rocks in it. It's mortar mix. Mortar mix is used for brick and block, and that's what you see between bricks and blocks is mortar. So that's what I use. Usually 4 bags does it. I keep a 5th one just in case out in the truck. And this is 2 bags emptied, and I got 2 more bags here. Once I mix that up, and I use a shovel and a hoe and mix it up, and I just kind of slop it into the sides and all around and everything, and kind of, like I said earlier, tap it down, you know, to get to the point where there's no air bubbles or gaps or anything like that. Then I'll use the other 2 bags and do the same process. And at that point, then I use this little handy blade here. I think it's a 12-inch blade, but I use that to kind of like smooth everything out. And that process alone probably takes me about 15 minutes of that 30 minutes I was telling you about, just because I do it by eye. There's a lot of cheat ways. I don't say cheat ways, but there's a lot of different ways that people do it. Some people will actually figure out that the edge of their liner will be a certain height going down to their drain with the slope, and they'll use some type of marker, whatever color they desire, and kind of mark around there with a level. And so when they start pouring in the mortar, they'll realize where the marker is, and you know that's the height that they need to be, and then the natural grade will go down. There's also these ridges that Home Depot and Lowe's sells, and you can actually put these ridges in. I think they're plastic, and you can cut them off to size, and they pretty much stay inside the bed once you're done, because once these ridges are done, they're so high in the back, and then they taper down to the drain. Once they're all cut and formed and all that stuff, then you pour the mortar straight in, and then just kind of taper off to the top of the ridges. And that's another way. And you know, I'm sure there's probably half a dozen or a dozen more different ways to do that. I do it by eye. I use a level, of course. I got a couple of different size levels, and the process, like I said, takes me probably about 15 minutes to just get it all tapered down to where I want it. The next day, tomorrow, this mortar will not quite be dry, and I use the same blade. I can scrape off any inconsistencies. If I'm a tad higher over here than I need to be, from over here to over here, I can kind of scrape off the inconsistencies, and then the following day, once it's thoroughly dry, is when I actually set the tile. Then I can manipulate my thin set according to any inconsistencies as well, and then put the tile down at that point. And that's how I do it, and it's just kind of part and parcel. It's redundancy that I've done for so long that I've just gotten used to my way of doing it, and it's not, again, there's all kinds of different ways you can do it. That's just my way. And so I'm going to get started on this one, and I hope you kind of learn something from this. It's so easy for me that I don't realize people really don't know about this stuff, and I know for homeowners it can get kind of complicated when they don't know what they're doing. But this is made to let you know how real simple this is. There's nothing to it. The process after this, you know, is pretty tedious too. It's just time consuming, putting the wallboard up and red guarding and all that stuff, and then it'll be ready for tile at that point. Anyway, that's it, and I'm going to get started on pouring this pan. Okay, as I said before, it takes me about 30 minutes. I think this took probably less than that, maybe 20. But anyway, it's poured, and I used all 4 bags. I could have stopped at 3. I would have had a little higher depth down here at the end. I think I have about 2 inches. By the time I wrap that with Durarock, it'll be a little bit higher. But I did 4. Now these ridges that you see inside the mortar, that's my level. So I always level on the corners and here, and then going across the back here. And the reason I do that, obviously I'm doing it for the slope, make sure I have a good slope going down, so when the water goes on, that you have a good draining. The reason I do it on the edge here is I want to make sure, since my first tile usually goes in the middle, I want to make sure that's as level as possible. And then the rest of the tile will go on the wall. The rest of the tile would get cut down at the bottom and make for an even row, since that will be my first row. Anyway, it is done. As I said, this has a little plastic on it, but there's enough holes in those the drain holes at the top where the water overnight will pool down here and go into the weep holes that I showed you earlier, and then also if there's any excess water, it will go over into the drain, into the little holes, and it will be pretty much dried tomorrow. I always put a fan on it overnight, about medium speed or so. I know they run their heat in here, and that helps take a lot of the moisture off of the pan. What I did notice when I put my level on is that this end is a little bit higher than that end, and I like them to be about level. So tomorrow morning when I come here, as I said, I use my scraper and I'll be able to scrape off the discrepancy and get that a little bit lower than it is now. But that's basically it. That is how to do a shower pan, and I hope that helped.